Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers is a weekly program designed to answer all your questions, including the ones you didn't even know you had, and to clarify the endless debates around the wonderful and fascinating world of sexuality. Join us for real talk about sex from two experts in the field. Richard and Larry Siegel have over 50 years of experience as sex therapists, educators, counselors, and researchers. The Siegel Brothers are recognized around the world as trainers of medical and mental health professionals.
Good evening and welcome to Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers. I'm Larry Siegel, a clinical sexologist and certified sexuality educator.
And I'm Richard Siegel, a certified sex therapist and supervisor.
And proud to say my amazing brother. And I don't say this enough. You often give me props, but I really want you to know how grateful I am to be able to do this with you and how proud I am of what you've done and you've accomplished. So
thank you.
I'm proud to be your big brother.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Cheers.
joining us this week on Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers.
There's a lot been going on this week. Continued coronavirus issues, continued sheltering in, continued protests. And we also have, I think it's gotten lost in the shuffle a little bit with everything. This also happens to be Pride Month. So I think we definitely want to acknowledge that. That's also historically important events that we cannot forget. And, there's so many, to use the word intersectionalities that are going on right now.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling that'll prove to be an important theme for tonight's show.
Yes, indeed.
Right?
Yes, indeed. And, we can't dance around issues of race. We can't dance around issues of gender discrimination. These are things that have been too deep-seated for too long. And, you see the posters and you see the signs and you see the shirts that, when we don't speak up, silence is complicity. And I don't think that's hyperbolic.
I agree. I don't typically plug things like this, but I was deeply, deeply moved, angered and moved by the Netflix documentary 13th about the 13th Amendment, which I think should be mandatory viewing for every American. Mm-hmm. It is a reality. And,
yes.
And we had quite an intense discussion that we will be sharing with our viewers a little bit later in the show. But as we like to start our weekly sex talk, we will begin with a little look at sex in the news.
All right. So one of the things that I want to talk about first is something that doesn't really get spoken about all that much outside of circles of the people who are immediately affected. Black Lives Matter, that's more than a slogan, but we have to even kind of see about bringing that up a little bit more because, there's often a question of which black lives do matter. Because when we look at the lot of black, gay, trans, particularly lesbian individuals, they have it worse than everybody. Talk about bringing all that stuff together. The intersectionality of abuse and trauma.
Mm-hmm. I know that, as the evening will demonstrate, these are topics that people get squirmy and squirrely and uncomfortable. And we should have uncomfortable conversations about a white supremacist a society that's built on these principles that are, as you said, so ingrained. As that documentary points out, slavery has never really ended in this country. It's just taken on different names and different forms. So for 400 years, we still have too many people in this country for whom black lives don't matter.
That's right.
And all of those tropes, that knee-jerk response, usually from Christian conservatives, well, all lives matter.
Right.
It's just such a slap in the face to dismiss the whole point behind the movement.
Right.
And that's, what we'll talk about, the privilege.
Exactly.
Now, the first item in our news is one of those things. Again, we want to be excited and cheer from the rafters as progress and an advance, but like with everything sexual, it comes with a caution, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in this week's news, there was a landmark Supreme Court decision. The conservatives on the court kind of surprised, the guy that
one in
appointed
particular,
them, right? Gorsuch wrote the what do they call it? The lead,
the majority opinion.
right. The decision ruled that LGBTQ workers are protected from job discrimination, and it refers to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964,
Right.
which of course is what people are still protesting about with police brutality and the civil
right.
rights of blacks and black and brown people in this country, which Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act for in 1964. Now in 2015, I wanted to quote from Gorsuch's opinion, sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision to discriminate against gay and transgender people, exactly what Title VII forbids.
Right.
And he went on to say, those who adopted the Civil Rights Act might not have anticipated their work would lead to this particular result, but the limits of the drafter's imagination supply no reason to ignore the law's demands.
Right. And the most gratifying thing about that for me was that got Scalia turning in his grave.
Oh, of course.
It really did. These so-called
Scalia.
textualists
Yes.
who seem to go back and forth about how you interpret previous decisions and laws. But unlike, I think, what a lot of really far-right conservative judges and other mouthpieces have been talking about, this is not legislating from the bench. This is doing exactly what Supreme Court justices are supposed to do. Interpret the law and make sure it is applied equally.
Only the written word is the law, and all persons are entitled to its benefit. Right?
Yeah.
But, of course, here comes the but. This I cannot wrap my head around, and I need somebody to explain this to me. Right? The article goes on to say, across the nation, 21 states have their own laws prohibiting job discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. 7 more states provide that protection only to public employees.
Right.
Those laws remain in force. But Monday's ruling means federal law now provides similar protection for LGBTQ employees in the rest of the country.
Right. And so
So gay people, trans people in those 21 states, tough shit? The Supreme Court decision doesn't apply to you?
well, but I think
You
some,
can
I
still
mean,
be
some of
legally
those,
discriminated against?
in some of
I don't
those states.
understand those laws remain in force.
Right.
When I thought Supreme Court, the law of the land, is supposed to, now I gotta, I'm gonna say, supersede. I gotta stop using Trump as a verb.
Yeah.
Right? Overrule. Right? Be more,
Right.
Trump state law.
Right. But you have
But
to remember
apparently
that but those 21 states already have laws prohibiting discrimination against people based on gender and gender identity. So I think they're basically acknowledging the redundancy.
No. 21 states have laws, prohibiting, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it.
So those laws are already in place that say you're not allowed to
Okay,
discriminate
never
based on
mind.
those issues.
Forgive
so
my
they're
misread.
going to remain in place.
Okay.
I think that's what that really is.
Good,
Right?
thank you.
But there is an important, there's still a little but that has
Of
to
course,
be acknowledged.
there is, because when the next court comes in October, one of
Exactly.
the first things they'll be ruling on
Mm-hmm.
is another one of these religious freedom bills.
Right.
So again, the same old debate. It's always couched in protecting religious freedom to once again legalize discrimination.
Exactly.
Because if somebody says it's against my religion to allow people in my employ to love this way or that way, then I'm exempt
Right.
from the law of the land.
Right. And
I
this
don't have to.
this decision that they're going to take up in August is based on a case from Philadelphia where
Right.
the city of Philadelphia prevented the Catholic Archdiocese from participating in the foster care program from the
because-
city
because
because
they
they
refused.
bar same-sex adoption, same-sex couples, and all of that kind of stuff. So
and
now that's being
violating
challenged.
federal law.
Well, right, exactly.
Right.
So they were barred from that,
As
but
they
now
should
this
have
Supreme
been.
Court challenge is to see whether or not
mean,
they are allowed to discriminate based on religious freedom.
A lot of people don't realize this, that the largest operator of hospitals in this country is the Catholic Church. And Catholic hospitals, St. Mary's, every church that has that kind of name, every single day violates federal law.
Right.
Title 10, all of these access to sexual and reproductive health, and they're just blanketly allowed to disregard the law because they have religious freedom. It's bullshit.
Well, of course it is. And every one of these, quote, religious liberty bills has all been for the sole purpose of allowing people to justify discrimination.
Right. Yeah, that's very Christian-like, isn't it?
Right. Well, how many times have I said to people like that, maybe you should be a little less Christian and a little more Christ-like?
Yeah.
That would be a nice little change of pace.
I'm Rachel Needle, co-director of Modern Sex Therapy Institutes, and Modern Sex Therapy Institutes is a continuing education provider. We provide continuing education for medical and mental health professionals around the world, and we have over 140 archived workshops on our website, so please check them out at www.modernsextherapyinstitutes.com. Also, we have a number of certification programs, including sex therapy, couples in sex therapy, LGBTQIA affirmative therapy, alternative relationships, transgender mental health care, medical sexology, sex education, and sex counselor certifications. In addition, we offer a PhD in clinical sexology. So please, again, go to our website, check out everything that we have to offer. A lot of our stuff is available solely online from the convenience of your own home or office. We do things live in 8 states and live via webinar as well.
So I want to come back to this idea of looking at the issue of violence and abuse against gay and transgender people of color.
Yeah, and just before you do, just to that point of intersectionality, there's always been another one of those uncomfortable conversations. There's been a bit of kind of a tension in equating the gay civil rights movement to the black civil rights movement.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, even in the gay civil rights movement, don't give enough credence to, at least from the history that I've read, that what's heralded as the moment that created the Stonewall riots, that it was really more black trans women than gay men who were involved in fighting back against the constant oppression and harassment by police. The exact same thing we're dealing with today.
Right.
So the idea that we always try and trumpet on this show that sexual health is impossible without social justice, and social justice means just that.
Yeah.
That the rules have to apply to everyone.
Exactly.
Not just some people or people of privilege.
That's right. And I think when we particularly talk about these issues with people of color, everything gets exponentially increased in terms of negative consequences. We've known and we've talked about for years, and this has been a problem that has not yet gone away, but when we look at violence against gays and trans people, that is across the board so much higher than the rest of the population. However, when you start talking about black gay men, black lesbians, black trans men and women, that goes up even higher. Here are just a couple of figures.
As do the levels of violence.
Absolutely.
Right? When you see someone stabbed 67 times,
that's right.
That pulls out some kind of rage in somebody.
Last week or the week before, there was the transgender woman's body that was found in the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, dismembered and completely mutilated. So, what we see a lot with not only the murder of black trans folks, it's not just murder, it's not just violence, but it's a level of violence that is so unique. Right? But it's not even just the violence, it is the social system in which it occurs. When we look at transgender people in general, there's often a very high unemployment rate. But the rate of unemployment for black transgender people is 26%. That is twice what the unemployment rate overall is for transgender folks, and that is 4 times the general population. Right? Black transgender people were affected by HIV in devastating numbers. More than a fifth of people, transgender people, are living with HIV. 20.23% compared to 2.6% for transgender respondents across races and culture, and 2.4% for the general black population, right, compared to 0.6% for the general U.S. population.
Wow, less than 1%.
Right. And
That's
this
appalling.
had disproportionate effect. Over half of basically black transgender or gender non-conforming youth, that are attending school, report harassment. More than half of them have tried to commit suicide. We used to talk about how disgraceful it is when we look at the teen suicide rate among gay adolescents and then trans adolescents, which is 3 times higher than the national average. This is 50%. Right? And when are we going to understand that this is a shame for us as a country?
Right, absolutely.
This is a shame for the populations. And
it's
again,
the same civil rights issue. Because homophobes and transphobes want to hold up statistics like that as evidence that they have a mental illness. No, the mental illness is our collective
getting
hatred.
murdered and abused is not a mental illness.
Prejudice is a mental illness.
Right.
Right? And violence for no other reason than someone is different than you is a mental illness.
That's right. That's right. And with gay men, it is hard enough to be a gay man in this country, and even though there have been great strides and more acceptance of that, it's still not quite the same among black men. Right? Lesbians, we see a lot of the empowering coming out of the black community and with sexual minorities, but how far is it really going? Right? Is there acceptance in the population at large? And this is part of that big problem. When we look in general at black sexuality, I think we often take it for granted. And I will admit that I am guilty earlier on in my career where I would take issue with that idea and, say, oh, do you think, penises work different depending on what color they are? Orgasms are different. But, I like to think that I came to understand this a little bit better. And there's this pervasive anxiety. There are these tropes that they constantly have to live with that we have the luxury of not having to deal with. Yeah. We can be free to express ourselves however we choose, and it took me a long time to realize that not everybody has that luxury.
And that's the uncomfortable thing called privilege.
Right.
That murky as it may be to define, just like that famous Supreme Court justice, I don't remember which one, defined obscenity by saying, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I know it
when I see it, right.
I think privilege is something that we have to feel on a more visceral level and
That's
understand, especially empathize with people who are denied it.
Right. And, we take for granted that when it comes to sex and sexuality, there really are a lot of these issues, right? There's the intersectionality with all issues related to sexuality that we can no longer ignore.
Right.
And that's why I'm so glad that we have our guest tonight.
Mm-hmm. It is indeed an honor, and we have a hell of an interview for you with our dear friend and colleague, another Philadelphian.
Yeah.
And a friend from ASECT, and just an all-around wonderful guy, Dr. James Wadley. And here we are with one of our favorite returning guests on the show, and a dear friend and colleague, Dr. James Wadley from Philadelphia. Welcome back.
Yeah,
hey, folks.
Really glad to have you back on the show. First, let me give you a proper introduction so that our audience knows. Not only did I have the incredible honor of serving as co-editor with this brilliant man.
Oh my gosh, you're coming in with props.
First text called The Art of Sex Therapy Supervision. But may I say, an even more impressive and Herculean task, James single-handedly edited this really
gosh,
book.
thank you.
the Handbook of Sexuality Leadership, which I hope will be read far and wide by any sexologist, anyone teaching, anyone doing therapy, anyone talking about sex, because it's something that's been critically lacking in a field that is, though relatively new, has been kind of stale in the latter part of the 20th century. I also want to include in your intro that you are the founding editor of the academic journal, the Journal of Black Sexuality and Relationships, as well as the founder and principal of the Association of Black Sexologists and Clinicians.
Yeah.
So part of what's been so exciting, seeing your really rapid rise in ASECT in terms of notoriety and just impressive feats in a relatively short time compared to these old farts sitting here that have been creaking around those rooms for a few decades now. The importance of ever more so than we've been cranking about, being frustrated for 30 years. The need for sexuality education and sexual health being vitally connected to social justice. So if we could start with that and ask you to talk about just how the organization and the journal came to be, and then maybe we can talk about fathers' roles in the healthy sexual development of their sons, particularly for Black sons in a country where it's still not safe to be driving while Black.
No, it's not. With the continuation of Black bodies being slain in any number of different fashions, and I think what the part that hit me last week or the week before was that in working with 2,500, 3,000 mental health workers, educators, therapists, whatever, I don't know. It just felt too quiet, and that silence is the same silence that I've experienced in kind of maturing in the field. Silence and invisibility. So I think I mentioned this on, I don't know, I was talking to somebody else that, whether it's textbooks or professors or supervision or SARS or whatever, rarely do I have an opportunity to see people who look like me. And so I postulated or speculated that one of the reasons why our field has so few Black men is that there is a proverbial knee on our necks where, again, it's hard to see images of ourselves and hard to be around people like ourselves. And so one of the main factors that has driven me to do this kind of work is that I wanted to see folks who look like me. And I wanted to read material about folks who look like me. And I wanted to have professors and supervisors or whatever, and it's freaking non-existent. So for whatever reason, I've kind of taken it on to, try to have, those sensitive conversations. I ended up coming to ASEC maybe about 5 or 6 years ago because past president Connie McCaffrey reached out to me and said, "James, where are you at?" And I said, "Connie, I'm good. I'm doing my own thing." And she said, "Well, James, there aren't a whole lot of people of color in the field. And I learned about the journal and I want you to come on aboard." I do feel responsible, not only for my own professional growth, but for the professional growth of people who are in the field and people who will come behind me. Where we struggle at is that we struggle to talk about race-related issues. And when race-related issues are brought up, people get really squirmy, like, "Oh my gosh, whoa, here we go, oh boy." But as professionals, we get really squirmy. And I had suggested to another colleague of mine that I'm going to hook you up with, Ruby Bowie Johnson, that we need to have a racial attitude reassessment where we sit in a room of 12 and 14 people. And this might be a good idea for Modern Sex Therapy Institute. You get 12 or 14 people sitting in a room, and we're going to talk exclusively about race. And we're going to deal with some of the images that we see on the news and in the media. We're going to talk about how race is constructed among along various lines across class, across age, across ability, across sexuality, because those are the conversations that as sexuality professionals, we don't have.
Mm-hmm.
So when I do supervision with whoever, if I'm doing it with people of color, it looks like one thing. If I'm doing it with white folks, it looks something different. And for the white folks who I spend time with, more often than not, this is their first experience, one, with a Black supervisor. Two, this is their first experience talking about how race impacts one's sexual functioning or dysfunction. And then three, this is the first opportunity where they have a chance to deal with their own bias, their own privilege, their own constructions about race relations in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes a powerful experience, or could be a powerful experience, if folks were to really do the work about why they believe what they believe.
You talk about how some of the motivations for you was really that element of invisibility. But it seems to me there's also an equally problematic piece to all of this of visibility, because I don't know that I can think of anything more threatening to society at large than an empowered, masculine Black man. We see even along class lines, right? You look at Snoop Dogg's kids, you look at Ice Cube's kid, you look at some of these kids that they're rich kids first and foremost until they hit adolescence. Then they become Black kids.
Right.
And I think there's a real, I don't even know what to call it. There is this process, there is this belief that's part of this social structure that it's just so deeply ingrained that I just have to ask if we can break that and how.
We can't break it. So our country was built on racism.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting example after example after example after example after example. And, unfortunately, the way that we as a society have been responding to it, the shit ain't work. You got to march, you protest, you march peacefully, and then you're still getting beat down or killed, right? So now it's like, okay, we're going to fight back. We're going to burn some buildings down. We're going to do this or do that. And we're going to, provoke some shit to happen because something has to give. You can't keep killing Black folks and getting away with it, even though some folks are still getting away with it.
Sure.
When's the last time you saw two white men get hung in the same town? It's not happening. Like, when's the last time you saw a white man get a knee put on his neck by a cop and be killed? It's not happening. So you have all these different representations of institutional racism. And what makes it an institutional racism is that the cops and some people are backed up. So you have this Black man or man of color somewhere on the East Coast, I can't remember the town. He's literally writing Black Lives Matter on his retainer wall. And so the white woman, she's social distancing, and she's thinking that the guy doesn't live there because he doesn't belong there. And she lied, saying that she knew the owner. So then she calls the cops. And there have been times where white women or people have called the cops on a Black man, and the Black man goes to jail.
Yeah.
Right.
That's institutional racism.
But there is a part of me that looks back and says, this is 1960s redo.
Yeah, it really is. And you would think that, we would have progressed beyond this, but we haven't.
Right.
And so let's bring it all the way to the field of sexuality, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at sexuality textbooks, I may have talked about this before, and the only thing that's in there about Black and brown folks are HIV/AIDS, single parent families, high rates of divorce, and that's it. And then in terms of representations in organizations, now ASECT has done a great job at, having a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, which is great and what's awesome. But ASEC would have to really sit still and think about how ASEC has evolved or not evolved over the past 53 years, 52 years. Mm-hmm. So ASEC, when Margaret Sanger came along, Margaret Sanger had her issues with some folks of lower socioeconomic status brackets, and usually those folks of lower socioeconomic status brackets, and more often than not, they were black and brown folks. And, some folks say that she was awesome. Some folks say that she was something else. Well, hell, let me call it out. So eugenicist, let's call it out. So you got Margaret Sanger, you got Masters and Johnson, right? So Masters and Johnson, they talked about sexual response, but they didn't really sample anything about black and brown folks, right? And there's nothing really wrong if you're looking at something in terms of physiology. No one would ever say, well, there's a different physiological response between black and brown, or between black folks and white folks, or brown folks and white folks. Right. But then in terms of aesthetics and attractiveness and hair texture or texturism. Mm-hmm. So if the texture of my hair impacts or influences how positively or negatively I feel about myself, making the assumption that the closer you are to being white, the more valued you are, then the kinkiness of my hair may be problematic, or the hue of my skin may be problematic. So nowhere in my training did I have conversations about texturism or colorism, which is what I'm describing, right? So then if there isn't any if the pioneers, if they're all, or the majority of them are white, if the textbooks that we read are predominantly about white folks, and there are fewer messages about people of color, and just about those three concepts that I named, if the faculty in these training programs are mostly white, then for a person of color to come into a field doesn't see him or herself, then what are we really doing, right? So let's say you go on a dating app, right? And you want to swipe right, you find somebody you like, and you meet that person, and the person asks you to come over to his or her house, right? So you go over to the person's house and you have a really nice time. It's really nice, you have a good time. Maybe you have sex, maybe you don't, whatever, you have a nice time. So then you go home and you continue to chat with the person, and the person says, well, come on over to my house and we'll have a good time. And you're like, okay, it's cool. So you go over to the house and you kind of do the same routine, you hang out, whatever, you go home. So then on the third date, you say, well, look, I've been to your house a couple of times. So why don't you come over to my house? Why don't you come over to my house for our date? And the person says, well, no. I don't know if I'd feel comfortable coming over to your house. And you're like, what? Like, what do you mean? And the person says, well, I just don't know if I really want to be in that space with you, right? So then with organizational wise, ASEC, Quad S, STAR, WAS, they're really good about inviting people of color to come to their conferences and come to these different events or whatever. But the moment someone of those organizations is asked to come to Sex Down South, ABSC, Poly Dallas, or any of the spaces that are predominantly people of color, so whoa, I don't know if I want to do that. If you're only inviting people over to your house and you haven't made an attempt to go out to meet those people in those spaces, it's exploitation. So here it is, you have these institutions or these organizations based upon white supremacy and institutional racism. That's what it is. It's not about the scholarships. I mean, the scholarships are good. It's fine. Everybody shell out some money for some scholarships, get more people of color. Fine. I'm not saying anything about it. But what's needed is that people of color need jobs. They need fucking jobs. So some folks in our field have had a 53-year head start in the field in carving out pathways. So what would it be for us to reach out and say, hey, you know what? I got this hookup here. You can come and do this. just because there aren't that many people of color in the field. I don't need a couple $100 to come to a damn conference, and I know good and damn well I can't afford to go to the next conference. I need a damn job. Give me a damn job. Or if you can't give me a job, help me create a job. That's what makes Rachel so awesome. Rachel's got 100 ideas.
Or at least a place to be. I mean, what I hear and what you're saying is that it's one thing to be inviting, but it's another thing to be accommodating and actually have something. You know, okay, you invite people to your table, but what are you giving them once they're there? What are you offering them? What is there for them after that? I mean, there's both explicit and implicit bias. And I think this is a very much part of that implicit bias that strikes me in a lot of ways as these people who, I think a lot of them know it and a lot of the people don't realize their implicit racism, you know, when they shoot down, you know, something like Black Lives Matter with the old trope of, well, all lives matter, you know, which is really just a veiled and in many cases not so veiled attempt to maintain the status quo and keep things as they are, which is this created, stratified, racially unequal society and social structure.
That's crap. All it says is your movement is bullshit, and stop complaining. And I
want to go back to what I was saying before, especially as the father of a son. You know, with all of this stuff, given how we can see that this system is structured to put their knee on his neck, given that, you know, it's easy to say, and still, you know, I talk to parents and they're still wanting to tell their sons about, you know, if you get stopped by a cop, you know, you just be polite, you don't talk back, you don't do that. But that's not even really a protective factor anymore. So how do you empower your son at the same time knowing that that empowerment can be taken as a threat?
Right. And you have, you know, hit upon, you know, the paradox of masculinity, where, you know, some boys are taught to be aggressive and assertive and independent and dominant and all those other things that go along with it. And then for some people of color and some families of color, while that is taught, there has to be some balance of submissiveness, right? Mm-hmm. So if you are pulled over by the cop, you can't be dominant and arrogant and assertive and everything else. You have to be submissive. Now, that may be true across the board, but because we've seen that institutional plays itself out in law enforcement, some law enforcement, as well as apprehending and detaining folks, it's a freaking crapshoot. So how does that play itself out with me? I'm scared to death. I'm freaking scared to death. So with my kid, I'm highly protective, and anxious and scared shitless that he will, well, eventually he's going to encounter it. So there's that. So there's no running from that. And so the lessons are, look, you know, for my oldest son, you know, you get pulled over, hands on the steering wheel, yes, sir, no, sir, or whatever, because you're not the one with the damn gun. So make sure you have your registration and your license and your insurance where it's visible. Keep them all together. So that way there are fewer motions in your car and you're not searching for shit. So pull it out, hand it to them. Yes, sir, no, sir. Hands together in prayer, right? And as a matter of fact, we got pulled over one time and we were driving through West Philadelphia and the squad, the lights were flashing. I'm like, oh shit, not now. So the cops walked up on both sides of the car. And at the time, you know, my son, he was enjoying the lights because he was 5 years old. He was 6 years old. He was enjoying the blue and red lights. So, you know, he said that, and I was wrong. I ran through the damn stop sign in a hurry to get to wherever. So the cop was cool and nothing happened. When I tell you my anxiety went up to here,
It's that right there is an experience that people have to, I think, have a better appreciation for. You know, you and I driving down the street, I see a cop in my rear view mirror, I'm worried about getting a ticket. You see a cop in your rear view mirror, there's got to be that anxiety about dying from
I'm
this.
worried about dying and getting never drink. Well, I don't drink, not really. I don't smoke, right? There's never going to be any drugs in my car. But there's been so much shit to happen to law-abiding citizens
Right.
that something could happen.
Mm-hmm.
So then I get detained. My kid goes down to DHS. And then what does that look like?
And when people wonder what all this talk of privilege means, you know, I think what how Dave Chappelle talks about how white people talk to the cops. Right?
Yeah.
That's privilege.
Yeah, exactly.
What is your badge number, sir? Let me see a black person do that.
Yeah.
I actually put that in the damn email on the listserv, like, privilege is a motherfucker. You don't have to worry about it.
Now, with your son, right? You mentioned you're kind of that kind of helicopter parent,
Right.
You know, because of everything going on.
Right.
What do you say to him? Right. What is it that, you know, what are the dialogues that you're having with him? Because obviously he sees all of this stuff, but I'm sure he doesn't understand certainly the finer points, even maybe a lot of the broader points. So how is it that you are sort of teaching him in the way that you are interacting with him right now?
Yeah. So my son goes to a predominantly white school here in Philadelphia. And there's a nice number of kids of color. Not a whole lot, but there's some. And so my wife and I, we have many discussions about how Black is beautiful and how you come from a great family who does A, B, C, D, and E. And we're intentional, while he goes to a predominantly white school, we're intentional about pairing him with other Black kids, like on the weekend. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't have fun with his white friends. I'm not even suggesting that. But we want him to be comfortable in his own skin as he gets older. And so part of that comes from my experience going to a predominantly white school, right? Mm-hmm. So I was the only Black male in my class. And so because I didn't see as many representations of myself, right? So I would come home, and you all know what Dove dishwashing liquid is?
Sure.
So I would take Dove dishwashing liquid, and I would pour it on my arm to scrub the blackness off my arm, right? So I knew back then that Black bodies weren't valued, right? Because if they were, I wouldn't be doing that.
Right.
And so it wasn't until, I think my mother caught me one day. I was like, hey, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm trying to make my arm lighter. And she was like, no. So then, they had me doing all these different cultural activities or whatever and putting me around more people of color. So in terms of him valuing his hair, right? So we let him grow his hair out, and he has he used to have this huge afro, and then we just cut it last week or cut it the week before. But we wanted him to find value in who he is as a young black boy. And so having those ongoing conversations about, why he should feel positive about, being who he is and, being who he is, and then allowing him to draw that. So when he draws himself with this huge afro that's sticking up. And he always uses brown. Yeah, he usually uses a brown crayon and maybe black for his hair.
Nice.
Those are the kinds of things that we talk about.
Nice.
It's always just such a pleasure talking to you, and we can go on all night, but I guess we should probably wrap it up with some final thoughts about Father's Day and what could be different this year.
Yeah. Happy Father's Day to, I guess, you too. Father's Day comes in a lot of different forms that I've learned. Happy Father's Day to the custodial and the non-custodial dads.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, some dads won't have the opportunity or privilege to be with their children. And so I just want to acknowledge that. Happy Father's Day to the single parent families. Because sometimes you take on these masculine-like roles and you have to be the father or the dad or whomever in the house or the caregiver in the house. So happy Father's Day if you want to use that language for those folks.
Sure.
And then for other men, I would suggest or like to add that, sometimes being a man is hard, but if you can be the best person for you and possibly your kid, then hopefully your kid won't have half as many struggles as you may have had over the years. And so I guess that's where I would end up at.
Wow.
Nah, it's a good point to end on. Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed that as much as we did,
Mm-hmm.
and I hope you found James' message as powerful as we did as well. And
Right.
we're ever so grateful to James for his time, for spending time talking with us, for serving as faculty for us at Modern Sex Therapy Institutes, and really, in all honesty, contributing to this change we've been talking about tonight.
Absolutely. And I want to make a pledge that this is not going to be a one-off conversation. This is not going to be just, content to bring it up once, wear a t-shirt that says Black Lives Matter and think we're doing something. No, we have to continue to have these discussions, and we have to continue to challenge the discomfort that has been stopping this and allowing this to continue unabated for so many years.
And I can't wait until this COVID thing is behind us and we can have conferences again, because I have been dying to go to James's conference in St. Thomas.
Yep.
During Carnival.
Yeah.
We can only hope.
We will.
But thanks again to
Yes,
James
so much,
for that.
so much, so great. Thank you.
And I just have a couple of announcements apropos to our discussion tonight. I'm very, very pleased and proud to announce on behalf of Modern Sex Therapy Institutes for our sexologists in the audience that we will be offering one full scholarship to meet full certification requirements to be a certified sex therapist to a person of color. So you can check out modernsextherapyinstitutes.com to find out how you can apply or get the message to someone you think would be a good candidate. And we're also proud to bring back the incomparable Shadeen Francis to do a training for all of our sexologists and therapists in the crowd. And I did not print out the page with the date, but it's called Power and Privilege in the Therapy Office. And again, you could find more information there at modernsextherapyinstitutes.com.
Yes, indeed.
So thank you for joining us this week for some heavy but important topics.
Yes, indeed.
And again, as we like to say, every day should be sex talk. And not all conversations, especially around sexuality, are fun and comfortable or sexy, but they're just as
important. Yes.
So we wish you the best. Now again, for real, happy Father's Day.
Yes, indeed.
Got my dates a little screwy, and you will be hearing more from us in the future very soon about Daddy's Little Girl, the role of fathers in the healthy sexual development of their daughters.
Indeed. And thank you for watching, and have a great week. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers. Join us each week on Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern. You can also follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay on top of the latest developments in the ever-changing world of sex and sexuality.